They have done legacy classes again for the WWE Hall of Fame, where they just put up the most unflattering picture of somebody that they can find in black and white to make it look like they were all at the turn of the 20th century, regardless of whether they were or not, and quietly shove them in with a 90-second video, right? To make sure that we all know that they're honoring the pioneers of the business that came before.
Well, in some cases, it was to plug in notable gaps in the Hall of Fame. For instance, Jim Londos, Lou Thez, like these are the kind of guys that were just thrown in with the legacy inductees. So there's still an element to that, but now it just seems like I don't know what the criteria or standards are to be on this list, because you get just a full range of possibilities in each induction class. Induction
or indictment class. Okay, 2020. And obviously they did all these this year, but they did the 2 years in the same ceremony. So the 2020 class, a legacy class, started out with a guy who should have been in by any measure, 10 years ago when they were in San Francisco or whenever it was, Ray Stevens.
Without a doubt, Hall of Famer.
Hall of Famer, the best worker of the 60s, in ring. Whether you call him the Shawn Michaels of his day or whatever, or the Ric Flair of his day, Flair idolized Stevens. Flair did the Nature Boy Buddy Rogers gimmick visually, but Flair's in-ring style was more Ray Stevens, because everybody always, just like they imitated Buddy Rogers, just like they imitated Ric Flair after him, they always imitated the guy that was considered the best worker of the time period. So, and Ray Stevens had number of runs in the WWF, so all the way around, Hall of Famer, no doubt, right? Right next to him, Baron Michelle Leone.
Interesting pick.
We're not scoffing at it.
Not at all.
It comes somewhere out of nowhere.
Would have been good if it was the WrestleMania in Los Angeles. Would have made some sense.
Yeah. As we all know, in 1952, I believe it was, Leone and Lou Thez set the first, or the all-time gate record, the first $100,000 gate in pro wrestling at Gilmore Field in Los Angeles. Leone was the top guy in LA and Thez was the world champion. And Leone was in the middle of a hot run. And obviously he didn't duplicate that anywhere else. Leone had a successful career, but that was his pinnacle. So he's a Hall of Fame guy, but there are many cases you can make like that we don't know how this was arrived at. That who in the office did Baron Leone, goddammit? How have we overlooked it? I don't know. Next, Gary Hart. And this picture, why did he's wearing a polo shirt. He looks like he's chewing some popcorn. I don't know why they would have picked this picture of Gary Hart, but Gary Hart's a Hall of Fame manager. He was part of the hottest run in Florida, turning dusty, babyface. He was a successful booker. He came up with the Freebirds Von Erich's original angle, got it started, and then unfortunately, got sideways with Fritz and wasn't there to see it play out till the end. So yes, he's as managers go, he's a Hall of Fame guy, but wasn't there one time he was going to have a run there and something happened? They didn't send a car to pick him up, and he's like, what the fuck are these people jacking me around for? And this was like 15 years ago. I think Court Bauer had something to do with it.
I think it was like 84 or 85. He was actually going to be one of those managers because they got all the managers from the territories.
Oh, that's right. As I'm conflating two stories. That was the first time, and then Court Bauer pushed for him, but they felt he was too old.
He had heat with someone. I want to say Jay Strongbow.
Yes.
It was someone, he had heat with someone who was tied in with the office, so he was, in his eyes, sabotaged before it even started. But in their eyes, what's this guy's problem? He just got here. So, I mean, it was both ways.
Yeah. Well, and to be honest, Gary wouldn't have been allowed to do or be what made Gary up there to begin with. But yeah, I think it was Strongbow. And he was like, I can hear him now in his head. I see the writing on the wall, brother. They're going to fuck me here. And he just went back to Texas.
When I was a kid, I thought he was black.
He did have at various points, because he liked to sit out and tan. And he liked to sit out in the sun from his days in Florida. So at some points he had the dialect because he grew up in Chicago in a mixed neighborhood, and he had that manner of talking anyway, and then he accentuated it because it made him sound more street brother and a little more evil when he put the inflection in it like that. But when he'd come up to you in the locker room, would you like some corn, brother? So it was he was sinister, but that's why he liked the kabuki and the foreign, heel types that he could make mysterious and give backstories to. Moon, the one man gang never had a name.
Yes, he did. Moon.
Well, that's right. The one man gang never had a name until he got with Gary Hart, and Gary Hart said, well, he's the one man gang, but he would call it your Moon, brother. Moon, the one man gang. And then he would talk about Halstead Street.
That's right.
South side of Chicago. That's everybody in Chicago knows. And Halstead Street also went not far from the UIC Pavilion, where we were working the NWA shows in Chicago. So that was kind of that whole flavor of. But anyway, Gary Hart.
Hey, listen, and again, to the point we made earlier with Baron Michelle Leone, if WrestleMania was in Texas, Gary Hart would be perfect for that.
Oh, my God, yeah.
WrestleMania, even in Chicago, because at least there's a backstory and he's not like the main eventer for a Hall of Fame. That would have been nice. Chicago or Texas.
And honestly, Florida. Gary Hart was huge in Florida and was the instigation for Dusty Rhodes becoming the biggest babyface of all time there over Eddie Graham at the box office, for heaven's sake.
And if we want to go international, WrestleMania in Australia. Could do that for Gary Hart.
There you go. Yeah. I don't know whether we'll see that one or not, just because the time difference. Well, who knows? It's not like it. We'll talk about that later on. Not like it needs to be a big fucking deal anymore. I'm going to skip over the next guy in the picture. We'll talk about him last. But the final guy in the induction class in the picture, Dr. Death Steve Williams. Maybe they're paying him back for destroying his fucking, not only his career, but his legacy. Because to this day, you get these, we've talked about it, you get these fucking morons. Well, this guy couldn't whip anybody. He wasn't so tough. Because of one fucking night when he tears his fucking hamstring and gets knocked out. Oh, my God. So maybe they're making up for that. But, Doc is, compared to some of the other people in this Hall of Fame, obviously head and shoulders above. If it was a all-time box office attraction, major Hall of Fame where everybody had to have major impact of a Londos or a Hogan or an Austin level, maybe Doc wouldn't make the cut. But in this, I don't see anything wrong with it, but except just the irony of the only place he ever went where he wasn't a top guy, didn't get over, and wasn't used to at least some of his best abilities, it puts him in their Hall of Fame. Your thoughts?
I think Dr. Death is a Hall of Famer, the strength of what he did in All Japan, and WWE seems to be accepting of international candidates for the Hall of Fame. He was great from, I would say great from, 86 on?
Yeah.
84 and 85, he was still figuring things out.
Yeah.
You should see him in 82.
And boy, well, I saw some of it. And I was there both with him and again him in 84 and part of 85 when he was figuring things out. And he wasn't reckless, but boy, you couldn't go anywhere he didn't want you to go, no matter who you were, until he figured things out. And then he got a lot easier to work with.
But I think, yes, Hall of Fame. For WWE Hall of Fame, and based on who they've put in, like you said, he's not Hogan, Londos, Fez, Buddy Rogers, but certainly a WWE Hall of Famer as much as anybody.
And the last name Brickhouse Brown. I knew Brickhouse Brown. We worked with Brickhouse Brown some. Brickhouse Brown was a great guy. But isn't this reverse racism? Because I almost guarantee, unless it was one of the agents or producers there that might have known or worked with Brickhouse, I can't imagine anybody in that company, if you said, who do you want to put in the Hall of Fame, that anybody would have even known Brickhouse Brown's name or ever seen him before. Remember, this is a company where I came back from lunch one time and one of the secretaries said I had a message from a Harvey race. So, point is this not an obvious example of they're looking for an African-American to be inducted even in a legacy class? And if so, who's in already that I hate to say this about Brickhouse, but who's in already that wasn't a bigger box office attraction than Brickhouse Brown that they couldn't have put in this spot? I'm just asking.
Let's clarify a little bit. For those of you who maybe only know Brickhouse Brown from when he was doing shoot interviews, or maybe saw him for a brief period of time, he was great in Memphis. And he was always really good in the ring for the most part.
Yeah.
I remember when they brought him into Mid-South in 84, I think.
Yeah. We worked with him some. He was a good worker, a good guy, great shape.
With that said,
he was never a box office attraction anywhere.
I can't imagine who would say Hall of Famer. And to what you talked about earlier, mentioned earlier, or alluded to, the African-American wrestlers who were in and aren't in, I could be wrong. Someone's going to go, oh, he was a legacy inductee last year. But is Butch Reed in the Hall of Fame?
Okay, good question. I don't know the answer to it. But he ought to be, if he's not before Brickhouse. I'm sorry. Because he was a bigger star in more places, and he worked for the WWF. But the reason I point this out is because it gets glaring here in a minute that maybe they're trying to fill quotas instead of interested in honoring these individual people. So let's go to, do you want to go to 2021 and we can keep all those options open?
And by the way, what you're referring to, I don't know if it's reverse racism or just racism. If they're literally just picking any African-American wrestler they can to meet an African-American quota for their Hall of Fame, is that reverse racism or is that racism?
Well, the only reverse part of it is that you're not downgrading someone of their race, you're upgrading someone because of their race, but that actually technically would just be racism, wouldn't it? Of some sort. I don't know. It looks awkward. As we'll get to in a minute, awkward. Let's go through 2021. And the first one, Ed Mike, okay, absolutely no question, Dick the Bruiser. Besides the fact that he caused so much trouble and got pissed off in 1957 that he just never paid the fine and never went back to fucking New York after the riot made front page newspapers, he would have, I'm sure, probably at some point had a run in the WWF. He was a big star everywhere he went for 30 years, owned his own territory, was world champion there as well as out in Los Angeles when it meant something, was one of the top 10 box office attractions in the business on a few different occasions. Iconic name, iconic look. Dick the Bruiser is a first ballot Hall of Famer in any kind of pro wrestling Hall of Fame. I would have to think nobody could disagree with that.
Again, he's not Landis or Thez, but that very next tier of guys, the Sheik, Dick the Bruiser, yeah. There are certain guys you kind of lump together as no-brainers, Hall of Famers. And
he was a guy, people, if he wanted to go on vacation somewhere, he would just call the territory and say, book me. I'm going to be there for a week. It'll pay for the trip. I mean, whoever could book Dick the Bruiser when he would, after he got his own company, would work outside the territory, and huge in St. Louis. That's the thing about Bruiser. Even when his own territory had aged out and kind of fallen apart. He was selling out in St. Louis in 1982. He'd been in the business 30 years. He was in his early 50s. And he was drawing, what was that one house he did with, was it with Flair?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was 18,000 at the Checker Dome.
Yeah. Now, he was a big star till the very end of Sam Mushnick's run as a promoter. And
yeah,
to your point earlier, big in his own territory, Indianapolis. He owned a piece of Chicago, so I guess you can consider that his territory too. Detroit.
Bruiser and Crusher were the iconic Chicago tag team.
Now, he's like the Midwest. Well, I shouldn't say the, because Vern fans will attack me. But he's one of the Midwest wrestling Hall of Famers without any question.
Do you think Bruiser and Vern were ever like? Well, Bruiser is probably mad at Vern because Vern was from Minneapolis, and Bruiser was from Indianapolis, and Minneapolis turned out to be a more lucrative market for longer. Because they both they became big stars on network television, then went home and bought or stole their own territories. It was the formation of the modern territories. Anyway, we're going to skip over a couple people. Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer.
No. Well, we could talk about Hall of Famer, but I mean, on the video I saw during the Hall of Fame, he was not called Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer. He was Bulldog Buzz Sawyer.
Explain that for the people.
He had a short run, maybe 2 months, maybe, in 1984 when Vince was going after everybody and he bought Georgia. Bulldog Buzz Sawyer showed up, I believe, with Lou Albano as his manager, and they didn't call him Mad Dog. Mad Dog Vachon would come in shortly after that, but it's not like he got a massive push. But he was Bulldog Buzz Sawyer, and then he was gone, and he was back in Georgia and Mid-South and everywhere else he wrestled throughout the 80s as Mad Dog Buzz Sawyer. But for a few months, he was Bulldog Buzz Sawyer.
Oh, was he there? Did they do that at the same time as Dynamite and Davey?
I don't think so. I think it was earlier. I have to double check, but
he went before them.
Because remember, they had a very short run where clearly Vince was trying to figure out what to do with them. And then they got disenchanted and signed with Baba and just said, fuck it.
That's right.
Vince had to go to Japan, actually sit down with Baba, which got on the front page of all the wrestling magazines, which were weekly, which Inoki didn't like, because here's his partner, Vince, shaking hands, and, Baba's all smiling. Vince looks pretty stern, as if he did not expect the Japanese wrestling press to invade this meeting. And he had to, negotiate with Baba as part of getting back the British Bulldogs, because they signed with Baba.
Well, anyway, Mad Dog or Bulldog, I don't know where this came from. Maybe some producer was a Buzz Sawyer fan. Here's a guy that it wouldn't have hurt his image one bit if you'd have known exactly who he was. Because he was an asshole and a prick. It would have made him an even more vicious heel. What an incredible, for that. I mean, I met him when he was 19 years old. He worked in Tennessee briefly in 1978, still had hair. And he was he was a meat-headed kid, but what a fucking beast. He was a shooter. He was a physical freak. And by early 80s, he was an incredible talent in the ring. People play that clip, or some of those clips, where he would take that ridiculous bump out of the ring where you'd drop kick him and he'd just fly backwards head first through the ropes looking up and catch something to change his trajectory on the way through. It was different every time because he just didn't give a fuck. Or when you would run his head into the post, we worked with him and his brother Brett in Atlanta when we first got there in 85. When you would run his head into the post, he would purposely not put his hand up and run his forehead into the ring post hard enough where people could hear it hit, and he would try to move the ring with it. And you wonder why he was a goddamn lunatic and on drugs or whatever the fuck. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, the head into the post and then the lunatic, or vice versa. But he was out of control. He didn't give a fuck. Sometimes the job guys at Atlanta TV hated him because he'd come in shorts and flip-flops on Saturday morning at TBS and maybe didn't know whether he'd even been in from Friday night. and he wouldn't have a bag with him, and he'd borrow one guy's boots and the other guy's trunks, the job guys who ain't going to say no to him. And then he'd work and then wear them out and leave in them. And they're like, what the... I've told the story. We had the fucking issue with him in that show in Georgia where he smacked me in the fucking face, and I whacked him back with a racket. He got hot and came into that fucking trailer. It was me, Bobby Eaton, Dennis Condrey, and goddamn, who was the referee? Was it Mike Fever, maybe? There's 4 of us, and Dennis has a gun, so, maybe it'll be even. But no, he was a piece of shit as a human being, but what an incredible fucking, physical performer. And you believed him. You believed he was a lunatic and he was off his rocker, because he was. And he's another one of these guys you could believe would go into business for themselves instantly, just if you crossed him, even if wrestling was fake, which was true. He would. And so that's why he got over that. I can't remember who he was working with, but he was on that when Flair was booking, and Flair liked him and brought him in and put him with Gary Hart. I won't say liked him as a person, but as a talent to book. And he did that flying fucking frog splash. Or what was he, 250 pounds, even though he's only like 5'10" and just jacked up, and landed on his wrist and snapped his wrist in half. And that was the end of that run.
That was Sullivan's Slaughterhouse. With
that's
Cactus
right.
Cactus and Buzz, and Kevin is kind of the manager, although he wrestled too.
That's right. And then did he come back later on with Gary then? Was he part of the...
No, that was it. He only came back. He did, I believe, a couple of house shows in California, because that's where he had his training school.
Yeah.
And then that was, early 91 or so, and then early 92 is when he passed.
Yeah, they found him on his front porch, OD'd, sitting in a chair. He was like, 33 years old or whatever?
It is weird for me when I see a lot of these guys who, when I was a kid and I watched them and they died, they looked so old, and now it's like I'm older than all of them. Yeah.
And it's strange. Well, somebody just, goddamn, when Iron Sheik won the WrestleMania 17 gimmick battle royal because he was so decrepit he couldn't take a bump over the top, so they let him win it. He was 6 years younger than Sting is now.
Wow. Wow. I never thought of it that way. That's nuts.
So there you go. But anyway, the next indictee, Paul Bosch. And this one is rich also because obviously Paul Bosch is a Hall of Fame promoter, and for all of the contributions to wrestling deserves to be in any Hall of Fame anywhere. But you just retweeted. Do you have that in front of you? Because I could paraphrase it.
Oh, I'll pull it up. I'll pull it up now.
Please pull it up. Because the only people, this didn't make Paul's final cut of his book in this exact fashion. The only people that saw this were people that had the copy of the original manuscript, which I mentioned it on the Back to the Territories video that I did. I read the quote, and you just tweeted a copy from the Wrestling News Arcadian Vanguard files. But Paul Bosch's quote on what should be on Vince McMahon's headstone after his dealings with Vince. Can you read that?
Here it is from page 721 of Paul Bosch's manuscript.
It was a lengthy tome.
Promoters who had long concluded their business on a man-to-man basis found out that loyalty no longer meant what it once did. The sad discovery that a handshake was something on which you could no longer depend made suspicion an element of negotiation instead of friendship. I suggest this as an epitaph. Here lies the body of Vincent McMahon Jr., who destroyed faith in the handshake.
So, as we can tell, Paul did not enjoy his dealings with Vince over the retirement show and Vince's involvement in Houston, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, but Paul should be in the Hall of Fame, without doubt.
Without a doubt. And the last thing he would have wanted was Bruce Pritchard giving an induction speech, so maybe this was for the best, the way they did this.
And the last two, here we go again. Pistol Pez Watley. Pez was a great guy. Pez was not only a great professional wrestler, but Pez was a hotshot amateur at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. And he got into the business by virtue of having a pretty, a decent notoriety as an amateur in Tennessee. And he worked for Goulas. He worked for Phil Golden's All-Star Wrestling, and then finally worked for not only Nick, but Jerry Jarrett on a few occasions. He had a long career.
Poffos, of course.
The Poffos. That led to problems in ever coming back to Memphis. But he's one of the Jive Tones with Tiger Conway Jr. They had fun with it. Shaska Watley. But he was a babyface. He was a heel, but he was never an attraction. He was an attraction on the card, but he was never a main guy, a featured guy, a pushed guy in a promotion that depended on him, I guess is so I liked Pez, but this is another example of, Dory Dixon would mean more in a WWE Hall of Fame because of his 60s runs for Vince Sr. and that he was actually used higher on the cards up there at that point than maybe Pez was most places that he worked. Who just came up with that?
I don't know. I mean, look, Pez had a couple of nice pushes in his career, Georgia, a few other places.
He was good babyface in Georgia for Ole.
But even the video they showed, all the footage they showed was pretty much maybe a few clips of him dancing as a Jive Tone, but him when he was a jobber in like 1990 for WWF. Yeah, well, they didn't even have footage to show of him.
There is not a lot of Pez's best decade in the business besides his brief 80s thing for Crockett would be the 70s where he was, and he was featured on top for Nick, but there's no footage and you can't really find any. So, but it just odd choice. Okay. Here's where the most controversy has come in apparently this year. Another inductee for the class of 2021, the final one, is Bruiser, Watley, Sawyer, Bosch, and Ethel Johnson. And Ethel Johnson, and the story has come out now more over the last few years of Ethel Johnson, Marva Scott, Babs Wingo. They were pioneer African-American women wrestlers in the days before Moolah, and late 40s, early 50s was the final days of the Mildred Burke era and Billy Wolf, really running women's wrestling, and they got in then and had careers in the 50s, and I think maybe to the early 60s, there about that time frame. Point is, not only did I don't know how Ethel Johnson, and they were all three sisters, by the way. I don't know how Ethel Johnson got the nod over Marva Scott or Babs Wingo, but when they did the video, and I did not see this video, but I heard the uproar, they used footage of Sandy Parker as Ethel Johnson. It wasn't like on purpose. They didn't know. Is this what I'm hearing?
Well, there's a even bigger story because apparently someone in her family got on Twitter, an account known as Vergoat, at Miss Azerni. I don't know how to pronounce this. I'm not even going to try. But the tweet, which is even more problematic, is, y'all need to fix this because if you're going to use my Aunt Ethel in the Hall of Fame, at least reach out to the family. And the video you guys used isn't her. Ethel Johnson was, all in caps, first black champion ever. If you're going to represent her correctly. If I was the family, I'd be pissed off too.
Oh my God. So has there been any explanation of how and Sandy Parker is another black female wrestler that wrestled in the 70s.
Decades later, yeah. She was in California in the 70s.
And they have a picture. Well, I've seen Sandy Parker wrestle live in Tennessee in the 70s. But the point is they have a picture of Ethel Johnson on their Hall of Fame legacy induction gimmick, and Sandy Parker looks nothing like Ethel Johnson. Besides that, even if you weren't a wrestling expert, if you're just in television, you would know what a film from the 50s versus a piece of videotape from obviously the 70s, maybe even the 80s looked like. That's why I said I didn't see this clip, so I don't know what they used. But it would almost have to be in color if it was Sandy Parker. And I'm not
it
saying
was in
that
color.
now as okay. They use this. Somebody up there is not colorblind, but they've got some other fucking cognitive issue with color. They used color footage of a 70s girl wrestler wrestling to honor the first black women's champion from back in the 50s, early 50s. And they couldn't figure that. There's a lot of clues there. So anyway, apparently, from what we would then be led to believe, somebody in that company said, oh, well, it's a pioneer female black wrestler. Let's look up a name. And then they didn't even bother to acknowledge the family. Well, or not acknowledge, but alert, stooge off to, hey, we're putting your family member in our Hall of Fame. They don't even get the permission to use these names. How would they be able to use these names and pictures and likenesses of people that have never worked for them, that the family didn't know, that nobody signed a release? How would that work? In a litigious company or a litigious-minded company, they're always scared of getting sued, and they got to have all their releases and their I's crossed and their T's dotted. Paul Bosch, did they let his family know? Well, who's it? Valerie just passed away. That was why the estate sale took place.
Yeah, and his family is Peter Burkholz, and Bruce Pritchard's never going to let WWE contact Peter Burkholz.
Yeah, and Joey is not able to.
Joey's right now being taken care of. Yeah,
right. So they're using these pictures and these names. They say they're honoring them, but
I read in the Observer, I think, that they didn't even contact Barbara Goodish when they put Bruiser Brody in.
So they just figure that everybody ever in wrestling is now in the public domain.
That sounds exactly like a WWE argument. I don't know that they exactly think that, but I would think so, yeah.
Well,
I'm looking at some of these other legacy inductee classes. They're just all over the place. Like, you can't even argue like one specific person just because the whole class is all over. Here's one. Listen to this. Buddy Rose, Shinma, Primo Carnera, Jim Barnett, Wahoo McDaniel, Bruiser Brody, S.D. Jones, Luna Vachon, Joe Cohen, and Toru Tanaka.
Joe Cohen.
I don't know who he is. Maybe an executive for WWE?
I knew Ed Cohen. I don't know Joe Cohen.
It says Joe Cohen here on their official graphic.
What does he look like?
He looks like a Joe Cohen. Here's another Hall of Fame. Listen to this, the legacy class. Stan Stasiak, Jim Landis, Rufus R. Jones, Dara Singh, El Santo, Cora Combs, Lord Alfred Hayes, Sputnik Monroe, Hiro Matsuda, Boris Malenko.
That's just like you clipped names out of newspaper ads from across the years and put them in a drum and spun them and then just dumped some out. The common denominator is everybody was in the wrestling business, except for Joe Cohen. We're not sure.
We don't know about Joe Cohen.
We don't know about Joe.
Crazy.
I don't care. I don't care. All right.
And we're talking about those other things being racist. What would be more racist than we have a black female wrestler who's, by all accounts, you would say a Hall of Famer, like you said, a trailblazer. She should be in the Hall of Fame. All right, let's just find footage of any black female wrestler we can and hope no one notices. That's fucked up.
I would like to think that they were just stupid and didn't know, but all their shit's labeled. All their tapes, they have the what do they call him? The curator or the archivist or whatever. Unless they just said, let's find a black girl wrestler, how would they make that mistake?
I have no idea. Like you said, Everything's labeled. And I don't think.
And if it ain't labeled, then why would you think it's Ethel Johnson? Oh, it's not labeled. It must be Ethel.
And there would be no footage from the Sandy Parker era that would be mislabeled. Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't Ethel Johnson working on that show. It was Velvet McIntyre. I wrote the wrong thing.
But we get Velvet and Ethel mixed up all the time because Velvet was from Ireland and she was blonde and Ethel lived 20 years ago.